Dawn on the 14th of July 1941 crept over fields east of Orsha, turning low mist into a gray band as men of Infantry Regiment 168 stamped warmth into their feet. The night had passed with a few stray shots and a distant mortar, and officers read the quiet as another Soviet withdrawal. In foxholes scratched into sandy soil, Germans checked rifle bolts and peered toward the tree line where yesterday's Soviet positions lay, empty. The air smelled of wet earth and curdite, and the morning felt more like an aftermath than the start of a new assault. Just before 8 o'clock, as a runner stooped to pass a message to an advanced platoon, the quiet broke. From the eastern horizon came a low rumble that thickened into a howl. Unlike the crack of field guns or the whistle of shells, men straightened in their foxholes as the noise swelled, as if a bank of unseen iron pipes had begun to scream across the sky. Moments later, the first impacts landed. Fire and debris tore through the Soviet rear, throwing up orange columns and rolling dust. Trench lines that had endured German artillery vanished under geysers of earth. Dugouts and bunkers became craters as the ground kicked under German boots. Shocked observers wrote of demolition rockets and bunker killers. Unlike any artillery yet seen, phrases racing rearward as staff officers tried to understand the new firepower revealed on the Orsha. Lined up by the summer of 1941, the explosions on the Orsha line were the violent consequence of a problem the Soviet Union had been trying to solve for nearly a decade. Long before German divisions crossed the frontier on the 22nd of June, Soviet planners understood that any future conflict with a mechanized European power would expose their vulnerabilities in artillery mobility and fire control speed. Throughout the 1930s, the Red Army had expanded its numbers and improved its armored formations. Yet the core issue persisted. Heavy guns could not be shifted quickly enough to keep pace with fast-moving battles. And once in place, they required laborious preparation to fire effectively. As Germany demonstrated in Poland and again in France, modern warfare favored formations that could strike, relocate, and strike again before defenders recovered. Inside the halls of the Reactive Scientific Research Institute, known as RNII, Soviet engineers believed they had found a different solution. Rather than trying to match German artillery piece for piece, they explored a system that could unleash devastating fire without the weight or precision requirements of conventional guns. Designers like Ivan Gavay and Andrei Kostakov refined small, solid-fuel rockets throughout the decade, testing launch rails, stabilizing fins, and propellants with the goal of creating a weapon that required minimal crew training, yet delivered overwhelming effect. Their efforts culminated in a 130mm M13 rocket, a projectile that sacrificed pinpoint accuracy in exchange for concentrated force. Across a broad impact zone, mounted on trucks such as the Z-6, a full battery could arrive, unleash dozens of rockets within seconds, and disappear before counter-battery fire had a chance to register their position. This concept answered a fundamental Soviet concern. If they could not outrun German artillery or match its precision, they could instead saturate entire positions, collapsing fortifications and sowing panic through sudden, irresistible blast. When German troops at Orsha faced these salvos for the first time, the shock they felt was not merely surprise at a new weapon, but the realization that the Soviet Union had introduced a tool designed specifically to break the tempo of blitzkrieg. The background behind its creation explains why that initial strike resonated so powerfully, and why the next phase of the Eastern Front would unfold under the shadow of escalating firepower. The weapon that stunned German formations in the summer of 1941 was, at its core, a simple machine built for overwhelming effect rather than elegance. Officially designated the BM-13, it combined a truck chassis with rails for launching the M13 rocket, creating a system that could deliver extraordinary destructive power in seconds. Mounted most famously on the ZIS-66 for truck, the launcher carried between 14 and 16 parallel rails, each one a guide for a single rocket. These rails required no breech, recoil mechanism, or complex loading apparatus. Crews lifted the 1.8-meter projectiles by hand, slid them into place, and prepared the electrical firing circuit that fed from a small control box inside the cab. The rockets themselves weighed roughly 40 kilograms and used a solid fuel propellant that burned evenly once ignited, allowing them to leap from the rails the instant an electrical pulse triggered their ignition. Though the BM-13 had an operational range approaching 8 kilometers, optimal use centered around 5, where its arcs of fire produced the densest pattern of impacts. Pinpoint accuracy was never part of its design philosophy. The M13 rocket's warhead relied on high explosive fragmentation, A charge capable of shattering wooden bunkers, trench ceilings, and lightly reinforced shelters, fired in rapid sequence. Each rocket created overlapping shockwaves that crushed fieldworks not through a single calibrated strike but through the sudden arrival of dozens of explosions within a tightly packed area. A full salvo could be emptied in 7 to 10 seconds, after which the truck simply reversed out of its firing position and disappeared before German sound-ranging units could track it. This mobility made the weapon more than a curiosity. A battery of launchers could arrive, unleash a storm of rockets, and be gone before the first German counter-battery rounds landed. As production increased, regiments would field dozens of these launchers, multiplying the effect until entire sectors of the front seemed to erupt simultaneously. German troops who first encountered this weapon at places like Orsha naturally assumed they were facing an experimental siege device, not a system deliberately engineered for mass deployment. The BM-13's combination of simplicity, speed, and devastating fire marked the beginning of a new chapter in Soviet firepower, one that would soon be demonstrated on a far larger scale as coordinated rocket regiments entered the fight. Dawn on the 14th of July, 1941 found the Orsha-Smolensk corridor trembling under the weight of German momentum, its roads choked with infantry columns, fuel trucks, and headquarters vehicles preparing for the next eastward drive. After weeks of retreat, Soviet commanders clung to any opportunity to slow the German advance, and that morning a rare target presented itself, a German battalion command post, and its supporting elements briefly clustered along a bend in the road. As units reorganized for the day's push, from an elevated observation point, Soviet scouts watched the dust settle around stalled supply trucks and infantry gathering in makeshift shelter pits for the battered Red Army. This fleeting concentration offered an opening that conventional artillery, still limping behind after repeated withdrawals, could not exploit quickly enough. In a nearby forest belt, the experimental rocket artillery battalion maneuvered its BM-13 launchers into firing position, the truck settling behind a curtain of pines. Crews aligned their rails toward the German staging zone and waited in silence for the coded signal. When it arrived, the order traveled down the line in a single breath. An instant later, 16 M13 rockets tore into the sky, leaving long threads of smoke as their shrieking ascent broke the morning calm. The first impact struck the German headquarters area, erupting with a force completely detached from the familiar signatures of mortars or field guns. Timber-framed command huts collapsed as if punched from above, fuel stores ruptured, and ammunition pits detonated in sympathetic blasts that rolled outward in violent pulses. Survivors attempting to regroup scarcely had time to gather their bearings before a second salvo arrived. Prisoners captured afterward described the sensation not as incoming shells but as the ground itself rising and twisting, a shockwave so broad and disorienting that some believed the Soviets had unveiled a new class of heavy artillery. For several critical hours, local operations of the 17th Panzer Corps stalled while medics, engineers, and field officers attempted to pull order from the wreckage. The success of the strike electrified Soviet commanders. For the first time in the campaign, a single Soviet weapons system had forced a German offensive element to halt not through attrition, but through instantaneous disruption. The shock felt along the German front line sent intelligence units scrambling to identify the origin of the attack, initiating a chain of reports that would soon grow urgent as more rocket units joined the fight. What happened at Orsha became the catalyst for the growing realization that a new form of Soviet firepower was entering the war, a realization that would shape the next phase of German analysis and adaptation. In the aftermath of the Orsha strike, confusion flowed through the intelligence channels of Army Group Center with a speed that rivaled the pace of the front itself. Patrol reports, field interviews, and hastily written unit diaries all carried fragments of the same bewildering message. The Soviets had unleashed a weapon no German formation had been trained to interpret. Soldiers described hearing a rising mechanical howl that seemed to swell from every direction at once, a sound unlike the clean whistle of artillery shells or the descending scream of Stuka dives. Others reported seeing long flame trails arcing overhead, followed almost instantly by explosions that arrived not as individual impacts but as dense, rolling clusters that swallowed entire positions. For officers accustomed to dissecting artillery patterns by sound and rhythm, these salvos defied all known categories. Early bulletins struggled for terminology. Some analysts proposed that the Soviets had fielded an oversized flam mortar, capable of hurling heavy incendiary charges in rapid bursts. Others speculated about rail-mounted frames launching experimental projectiles. a theory supported by the strangely uniform spacing of craters observed near Orsha. Throughout late July, as more units reported encounters, a clearer pattern emerged. The Soviets were firing dozens of explosive rockets in seconds from mobile platforms that vanished before counter-battery teams could respond. It was during this period that German troops began using the nickname StalinOrgan, or Stalin's organ, a reference not only to the launcher's pipe-like rails but also to the eerie, organ-like wail produced at ignition. The psychological impact became impossible to ignore. Morale assessments from divisions such as the 78th Infantry recorded spikes in anxiety whenever troops heard the first rising howl of an incoming salvo. In several cases, frontline elements temporarily abandoned forward trenches during bombardments, describing the blast as too chaotic to counter and too sudden to predict. German artillery officers, long convinced of their superiority in precision gunnery, now faced a system that attacked not accuracy but battlefield nerve itself. Despite accumulating field accounts, intelligence analysts still lacked a captured launcher or an intact rocket, leaving their reports speculative well into 1942. The consensus eventually formed that the weapon consisted of solid-fuel rockets, launched from truck-mounted rails. Yet by the time this conclusion was circulated, Soviet production had already accelerated, and new rocket units were entering the field in increasing numbers. These early misunderstandings exposed how profoundly the weapon destabilized established German expectations, setting the stage for the next chapter. The industrial expansion that would ensure rocket artillery became a defining force on the Eastern Front. The shock that rippled through German lines in July 1941 quickly reached Moscow, where the Soviet High Command recognized that the weapon tested at Orsha had achieved exactly what years of research had promised. Within weeks, a formal directive issued in August called for the rapid expansion of rocket artillery production, pushing Soviet factories already under immense pressure to redirect machinery, manpower, and raw materials toward the creation of launch rails, truck mounts, and thousands of M13 rockets each week. The timing coincided with the massive industrial evacuation underway, as whole factories were dismantled and shipped east of the Urals to escape German air attack. In the chaos of relocation, the simplicity of the BM-13 system proved a logistical blessing. Unlike heavy artillery, which required precision machining and expensive alloys, the Katyusha relied on modular steel rails and solid-fuel rockets that could be manufactured with relatively crude equipment. Plants like Factory No. 92 in Gorky, alongside facilities in Voronezh, Sverdlovsk, and later Chelyabinsk, were tooled entire assembly lines for rocket production. The propellant, based on straightforward chemical formulations, could be mixed and cast quickly even as supply networks fractured under wartime strain. Engineers emphasized interchangeability. Launch racks were designed to bolt onto whatever trucks were available, whether the robust ZIS-6, the more common ZIS-5, or beginning in 1940 to the Studebaker US-6 trucks arriving through Lend-Lease. This flexibility allowed the Red Army to expand rocket units faster than any single factory could standardize a vehicle fleet. By mid-1942, the scale of production made possible the creation of dedicated Guards mortar units, formations marked by elite designation and tasked exclusively with operating rocket artillery. Their doctrine grew directly from battlefield necessity: launch a massive salvo, immediately relocate to a secondary position, and remain in constant motion to frustrate German counter-battery teams. To sustain this tempo, logistics officers coordinated the flow of thousands of rockets to frontline sectors every day, ensuring that each regiment could fire multiple salvos during major operations. The industrial commitment meant that by the time German intelligence pieced together a workable understanding of the system, the Soviets were already fielding enough launchers to blanket entire fronts with rocket fire. What had begun as an isolated shock at Orsha now evolved into an operational capability, capable of shaping battles rather than simply disrupting them. With production secure and the first Guards mortar units entering the line, the stage was set for the winter of 1941-42, when the expanding rocket force would be tested in the desperate fight to halt the German march toward Moscow. Winter arrived on the approaches to Moscow like a second army, grinding machinery, freezing rifles, and turning every field into a slab of iron. By early December 1941, temperatures had plunged to levels that immobilized German vehicles and strained their already overstretched supply lines. Yet the Wehrmacht still held a chain of defensive positions running through villages, forest clearings, and makeshift bunkers. When the Soviet winter counteroffensive began, commanders understood that breaking these fortified pockets quickly was essential to regaining the initiative. Conventional artillery struggled to reposition in deep snow and sub-zero winds, but the rocket regiments, newly expanded and eager to prove their worth, could fire, relocate, and fire again long before German units regained their footing. Near Klin and Klinen, the 8th Guards Mortar Regiment demonstrated this new capability with a precision that surprised even their own infantry observers. In the hours before Soviet rifle divisions advanced, entire batteries of Katyushas unleashed mass salvos into German artillery staging zones. The frozen ground amplified the blast. Instead of absorbing shock, the hard winter surface transmitted it outward, cracking trench roofs and collapsing dugouts built with logs and frozen earth. German reports describe snow rising in columns taller than trees, followed by rolling waves of explosions that shredded earthworks and tore open communications trenches. Soldiers who had endured months of artillery fire wrote of rocket barrages as qualitatively different, less predictable, more suffocating, and nearly impossible to withstand without temporarily abandoning positions. For the first time, Soviet commanders coordinated multi-battery strikes, turning dozens of launchers into a single instrument of rolling devastation. The effect forced several German regiments to retreat from key crossroads and village strongpoints, granting Soviet rifle divisions the narrow windows they needed to advance. Even when momentum faltered later in the winter under the weight of logistics, exhaustion, and the brutal cold, the operational value of rocket artillery had become indisputable. Katyushas were no longer merely disruptive weapons. They were shaping the sequence of battles. These winter successes convinced the Soviet high command that rocket regiments could serve as strategic tools in major offensives, not just as instruments of shock. The expansion of Guards mortar formations accelerated throughout 1942, laying the groundwork for the next phase in their evolution. Ahead lay the Volga, Stalingrad, and a battlefield where rocket fire would be woven even more tightly into combined arms operations. By mid-1942, the howl of a Katyusha salvo had become one of the most dreaded sounds on the Eastern Front, a noise German soldiers described with a mixture of awe and fear. Unlike the crisp crack of artillery or the descending whistle of mortar rounds, the Katyusha's rising mechanical wail offered no clear cue for survival. It swelled unpredictably, as if the air itself were being dragged toward the battlefield before erupting into a storm of detonations. Veterans who had learned to judge distances and trajectories by sound suddenly found those instincts useless. A rocket barrage arrived not in discrete impacts but as a sustained wave, a rolling sequence of explosions so tightly spaced that no soldier could tell when the salvo had reached its peak or whether the next seconds would bring even worse destruction. Field hospitals across Army Group Center and Army Group South began recording cases of acute stress reactions following mass salvos, men shaking uncontrollably, unable to speak, or convinced that entire battalions had been wiped out even when casualties were comparatively limited. Captured German prisoners consistently echoed the same dread, referring to the rocket regiments as Stalin's fire batteries and insisting that no fortification, however reinforced, could truly resist them. In diaries recovered from the front, soldiers wrote of huddling in trenches, counting explosions without knowing whether they were nearing the end or the beginning of the strike. Soviet commanders quickly recognized the tactical value of this fear. Before major infantry pushes, rocket regiments were ordered to devastate not only defensive structures, but the morale anchoring them. Entire German platoons sometimes abandoned forward positions in the seconds after a barrage lifted, giving Soviet rifle units brief but crucial windows to penetrate defensive lines. Even junior German officers admitted frustration in reports, noting that traditional countermeasures, digging deeper, dispersing more widely, building stronger overhead cover, offered little reassurance. When dozens of rockets could collapse trenches before orders even circulated, this mounting psychological strain fed directly into Soviet operational planning. As the front shifted toward the Volga and the contested ruins of Stalingrad, Katyusha units prepared to unleash their firepower in environments where fear magnified every blast. The weapon's reputation had already exceeded its physical footprint. It was now a tool for breaking enemy resolve long before infantry arrived. Ahead lay battles where that psychological edge would prove decisive. The battle for Stalingrad transformed the Katyusha from a fearsome support weapon into a central instrument of Soviet strategy. When fighting erupted along the Volga in late summer 1942, the city's dense maze of factories, housing blocks, and rubble-choked streets became an amplifier for rocket fire, A single salvo that might have torn open trenches in open country now collapsed entire buildings, sending shockwaves through basements where German platoons sought shelter. Soviet commanders recognized immediately that the city's shattered landscape magnified every blast, allowing Katyusha batteries to inflict disproportionate damage on German assault groups, pushing toward the riverbank. Because moving conventional artillery inside Stalingrad was nearly impossible, many rocket regiments were positioned on the eastern shore of the Volga. Their launch rails angled across the river toward German-held districts. From these safer staging grounds, they could deliver strikes on captured factory complexes, assembly points near the grain elevator, and temporary headquarters established in ruined apartment blocks. The rapidity of these strikes helped compensate for the Red Army's limited maneuverability. Within the city, German combat engineers attempting to fortify positions inside industrial sites, such as the Barricade and Red October complexes, repeatedly suffered heavy casualties when sudden rocket salvos detonated overhead, collapsing floors and burying men beneath layers of concrete and steel. The strategic weight of the weapon became unmistakable. During Operation Uranus in November 1942, as Soviet armor and infantry launched the Great Double Envelopment around the German Sixth Army, Katyusha regiments delivered simultaneous barrages along the northern and southern axes of attack. The blast tore through Romanian lines that formed key segments of the German perimeter, stunning defenders and accelerating the breakthroughs that would soon close the encirclement. German attempts to reorganize were battered by renewed salvos that struck road junctions, gun positions, and fallback trenches before orders could be relayed. Stalingrad demonstrated that rocket artillery could serve multiple roles at once: preparation fire, shock fire during breakthroughs, and active suppression during encirclement operations. The battle proved that massed rocket salvos could coordinate wide-front Soviet offensives without relying on slow, heavy-caliber guns. What had begun as an experiment in asymmetrical firepower now stood at the center of a turning tide. Soviet commanders carried these lessons forward into the next year, preparing to use Katyusha saturation fire on an even larger scale in the summer of 1943, when the open fields around Kursk would become the proving ground for a new era of preemptive, rocket-supported defensive strategy. By the summer of 1943, the Red Army had transformed rocket artillery from a disruptive novelty into a core component of its defensive doctrine, and nowhere was this clearer than on the fortified approaches of Kursk. In anticipation of Operation Citadel, Soviet engineers constructed a multi-layered defensive system: mine belts, anti-tank ditches, trench networks, and deeply embedded gun positions supported at every level by massed artillery and dedicated rocket regiments. Katyusha units were woven directly into this framework, placed in concealed firing areas behind the main defensive belts, where they could strike at German concentrations long before armored spearheads reached Soviet lines. At dawn on the 5th of July, as German panzer divisions in both the northern and southern sectors finalized their assault formations, Soviet commanders issued preemptive fire orders. Within moments, thousands of shells and rockets slammed into assembly zones, catching trucks, infantry battalions, and artillery crews. In the midst of final preparations, Katyusha batteries delivered their salvos in rapid succession, saturating tank parks and staging grounds with explosions that rolled across the fields like successive shockwaves. German reports later described supply convoys obliterated, command posts thrown into confusion, and battalions forced to scatter before their attack had even begun. The initial bombardment did not halt the offensive outright, but it disrupted timing, reduced cohesion, and forced panzer formations to advance under conditions far less favorable than German planners had envisioned. Throughout the ensuing days, Katyusha regiments acted as flexible fire brigades. When Soviet frontline commanders detected German attempts to mass for secondary thrust or exploit weakened sectors, rocket batteries fired rapid response salvos that blanketed those assembly areas. The weapon's lack of precision mattered little in this environment. Its strength lay in area denial. German armored groups, already hindered by dense minefields and anti-tank guns, now had to disperse repeatedly under rocket attack, losing the concentration essential for breakthrough tactics. The psychological toll remained acute. Troops advancing under rocket fire described moments of disorientation, in which visibility vanished in smoke and dust, orders were drowned out by rolling detonations, and unit cohesion faltered. The combination of physical disruption and mental strain contributed to slowing the German advance, until their offensive momentum collapsed. Kursk confirmed that Soviet rocket doctrine had reached maturity. Coordinated mass fire, swift relocation, and seamless integration with conventional artillery and defensive planning. As the Red Army prepared to shift permanently to the offensive, Katyusha units were positioned to support the deep armored drives of 1944, where the next phase of Soviet strategy would unfold across the vast expanses of Eastern Europe. The battlefield successes of the Katyusha did not hide its shortcomings, and as the war progressed, Soviet commanders found themselves confronting the limits of a weapon built for speed and saturation rather than precision. The BM-13's rockets, designed to blanket wide areas, lacked the pinpoint accuracy required for missions such as neutralizing isolated gun emplacements or supporting infantry at dangerously close range. As Soviet operations expanded into more complex environments, dense forest, swamp regions, and deep snow zones, the vulnerabilities of truck-mounted launchers became increasingly apparent. Z-6 and later Studebaker trucks struggled through mud and shell-churned ground, while their thin armor made them easy targets for German aircraft patrolling contested corridors. To preserve the rocket regiment's momentum, crews and engineers adopted a series of adaptations. Mounting launch rails on T-60 light tank chassis created armored variants that could survive in forward areas where trucks could not. In regions where roads were impassable, launchers were fitted onto tractors, sled-mounted frames, and even river barges that drifted into position along waterways before firing. These improvisations allowed rocket units to maintain mobility across the varied terrain of the Eastern Front, ensuring their salvos remain available wherever the fighting intensified. The rockets themselves also evolved. The dense smoke trails of the early M13 often reveal the launcher's location, forcing crews to relocate immediately after firing. Soviet doctrine adapted by emphasizing lightning-fast displacement. Crews were trained to load, fire, and vanish within minutes, and by employing deception, dummy launchers made from logs and sheet metal drew German counter-battery fire away from real positions. The introduction of heavier rockets such as the 300mm M31 added new levels of destructive capability. Their larger warheads capable of smashing reinforced bunkers and concrete structures that earlier rockets struggled to breach. By late 1943 and into 1944, new launch systems like the BM-3-112 improved stability, accuracy, and firing reliability. Meanwhile, specialized logistics battalions were organized to ensure a steady flow of thousands of rockets to frontline guards mortar units, allowing these regiments to sustain prolonged operations during major offensives. Though never intended to replace traditional tube artillery, the evolving rocket arm became indispensable to Soviet combined arms tactics. These refinements meant that when Operation Bagration opened in 1944, Katyusha units entered the campaign as a mature, highly coordinated branch of fire support, capable of delivering the massive, rolling bombardments that would help drive the Red Army deep into Eastern Europe and toward the borders of the Reich. By the final months of the war, the rising mechanical howl of Katyusha rockets had come to symbolize the full weight of Soviet momentum. Across Poland, Belarus, and East Prussia, German units retreating westward frequently described rocket salvos as the unmistakable opening signal of another Soviet offensive. The moment the sky filled with those shrieking trails, commanders understood that defensive lines, however carefully prepared, were about to buckle under the pressure of massed fire. Even though the rockets lacked the accuracy of traditional artillery, their overwhelming volume, rapid deployment, and ability to shatter morale made them one of the most decisive elements of Soviet fire support. In battle after battle, from river crossings to urban assaults, Katyushas cleared the path for rifle divisions and armored brigades pushing toward the heart of the Reich. The influence of the BM-13 extended far beyond 1945. The core principles behind its design, mobility, saturation fire, and the ability to deliver destructive force in seconds, became foundational to post-war rocket artillery across the world. Dozens of nations adopted systems inspired by its philosophy, integrating massed rockets into doctrines that valued rapid area denial and shock action. Yet despite the generations of launchers that followed, the original impact of the Katyusha remains defined by those first moments in 1941, when German soldiers, confident in their mastery of artillery warfare, suddenly faced a weapon capable of erasing entire positions. Before they understood what was happening, the shock they experienced radiated outward through every later encounter, shaping German expectations and forcing strategic recalculations across the Eastern Front. As the narrative returns to the stunned infantrymen on the Orsha line, who witnessed the weapon's baptism of fire, the legacy of the Katyusha becomes unmistakable. It stands as one of the most iconic and transformative weapons of the Second World War. A reminder that innovation, born of necessity, can reshape the battlefield and alter the very course of history.